everyone. We give just 30 seconds in case there's anyone jumping over really quick. All right. Well, welcome everyone. I know there's probably a few more folks that may be joining on as we get everything started, but we want to get kicked off because we have a lot of great content to go through today. My name is Katie Curtis. I am the Director of Corporate Social Responsibility and Diversity Inclusion at Nutanix. And I also have the great pleasure of being the co-chair of the Programs Committee and a board member for CIVIC. Really excited to be here today. This is a topic that comes up incredibly often. I think in probably every conversation and event that we have, telling your story and talking about how to elevate your brand comes up. And I think this is going to address a really specific niche in PR and PR response. So we're really excited to have you here today. And we have two incredible women, Sarah Hogan and Corey Streetman of Barefoot PR joining us today. And we'll share a little bit more about them shortly. We all know that words matter, especially over the past couple years as we've gone through a lot of different things with issues of racism and awareness of racism that's happening, climate justice, protests, tragedies, living through a pandemic and living Zoom life and working remotely. A lot of other social and political events, and so many things have happened over this past year that we've all had to pivot and adjust to, and in a lot of cases, learn how to respond to as a company. Increasingly, consumers and employees are demanding that our companies and our brands respond to and use our public platforms in an authentic way that invites the transparency and accountability needed, that really shares what our actions and intentions are around these issues as they come up. So in the next hour, we're going to learn everything that we need to know about authentic public statements in 1 hour with Corey and Sarah. And in case you guys don't know them, I'm going to pass it over to my peer, Angie, are also on our programs committee chair, to share a little bit more about the women that you'll be learning from today.
Awesome. Thank you. Oh, perfect. Thank you, Katie. If anybody can hear in the background, we're having some bathroom things going, renovation stuff going on in our house. So apologies for that. But as Katie mentioned, my name is Angie, and I actually recently joined Strive Health, which is a healthcare technology startup here in Denver, managing their communications and culture work, but very tied into the CSR community and CIVIC, and very happy to be here. And this is certainly a topic throughout my career and currently what I'm focusing on that's really, really important. And I think I'm just truly super excited to hear from both Corey and Sarah. So just to read a little bit more about them, Sarah is Barefoot PR's resident word nerd and co-founder. She's been telling stories her whole life, honestly, before she knew how to hold a pencil. And one of the earliest memories she shared as an impatient 3-year-old, urging her mom to write down the poem she had in her head. So absolutely a wordsmith and just totally communications focused. Corey is Barefoot PR's other co-founder and the chief executive in charge of making the dream work. Corey has been learning through life experience since she left home to travel the world at 19. She's taught English in Peru, studied cultural anthropology in West Africa, and she really has a knack for relating and understanding people. And I've actually had the pleasure of working with both of them at past organizations and learning from them. So excited to turn it over to you both. And one thing I just realized is a few virtual housekeeping notes. So I'm taking it back and then I'll turn it back over. But please do share your comments, thoughts, and questions in the chat. We will reserve some time for questions later. We would also love for everyone to keep themselves muted. We recommend using speaker view for today's session so that you can see the presentation and our speakers. This session will have live captions. When prompted, you can choose to have those captions displayed or not. And if you need any technical assistance, please contact Jess at CIVIC. She is on this call. You can chat her. And of course, this event is being recorded and will be emailed out with handouts after the event. Okay, Corey and Sarah, back to you.
Awesome. Sorry, we were technical difficulties on the back end. Hi, everyone. So I'm Corey and this is Sarah.
Hello.
And we are just really excited to be here to chat with all of you. Barefoot PR is our firm, and we have been members of CIVIC since the very beginning. So count ourselves lucky to be one of the founding member companies and have been really involved as an organization and individually for many years now. And so we love the opportunity to come and talk about the things we do best with this group because we so often learn from others who are a part of CIVIC. And so excited to talk about this. All right, so just to get started, we would love to use the chat function and just ask all of you to put your answer in to this question. So what is your biggest concern when it comes to crafting or actually making authentic public statements? So really, what brought you here today? And I'm going to give everybody a few minutes to put their answers in the chat, and then we'll regroup. So I appreciate the wonderful introductions from Sarah and I, but a little bit more about Barefoot for those of you who don't know us. We are a public relations and design firm. We are celebrating 11 years. Thank you for chatting that in the chat there, Kirsten. We have been around 11 years as of last month, and we work on a lot of different issues, but everything that our firm does, our people are involved in, has something related to social issues, moving forward some sort of positive impact in the world, and that can be defined in a lot of different ways. A lot of our clients are in the nonprofit sector, also have a number of clients in the government agency world, as well as the for-profit world. We are just a little choosier on that front, and we love to work with companies that already have that value built in of wanting to partner with the community, make an impact, push forward a social issue in some capacity, and our job is to help them tell those stories. All right, so we have, let's see, a couple things in the chat here. And for those of you who are just let in, the question again is, what is your biggest concern when it comes to crafting or making authentic public statements? All right, so Angie said, taking a stance on something that appears inauthentic. We are going to talk about that.
We will talk about that.
Yes, authenticity is incredibly important when it comes to public statements. Biggest concern from Alyssa is consistency in communicating the thread back to our values. Love that. And yes, also very important. Tina, being careful with tone while being honest. Voice and tone is also very important. These are going to help us as we go through the next, the slides and the examples. Mary, hi Mary, you say that you worry about being both succinct as well as authentic. Again, authenticity, we will talk about it. And Jen, hi Jen, making sure you're keeping your organization's interests in mind while also being as transparent with reporters as possible. So looping in that, how do we talk with the media, which we do know a lot about. And Katie added, determining when to respond if you don't have a program or action that just supports your views yet. Yes, also a great point, and we will talk about that. And one more just came in from Hillary, commenting on issues that our company doesn't have a firm stance on due to pressure from within the organization, specifically with social. Thank you for bringing that up. And yes, we will talk about it.
We will.
All right, so I encourage you all to continue to use the chat function. I've got another screen down here and I'll kind of keep an eye on it. We don't have a ton of breaks built in, but we will answer questions at the end. But for sure, we'll keep an eye on the chat. And if you guys want us to pause, feel free to put it in there and we'll do so. All right, so just a quick overview of what we're going to cover today. So we're going to kind of give you like a landscape overview. Sarah, our resident word nerd and also queen of research, has done quite a bit of research and continues to monitor what's happening out in the world and is going to kind of share with you why this public statement strategy has become so popular. We're going to kind of take you through what we see as a process for developing a public statement. And then we're going to share some good, bad, and examples, and then some definitions of what we call the ugly. And then, of course, we'll leave some time for Q&A.
Perfect.
So, all right, I'll hand it over to Sarah.
You know, I think we can all acknowledge, and maybe we need to take a moment to give ourselves like a little hug, that over the last couple of years, we've been through a lot, both as humans and as representatives of our companies. And I think we wanted to take a minute to really just kind of talk about that landscape and why that pressure has felt so big. I think, you know, you see all the moments, but there are some factors that play into this. As a note, some of these items are also helpful, I think, as you're talking with your C-suite or other kind of director level people who may be giving some pressure or feeling reluctant. In our slides, if you want them, I did include at the end a bunch of resources that are available. So I will mention them here, but if you want links to those resources, we're happy to provide them. So I think this idea of responding to issues has always been part of the work of communicators, but that increase in fluency over the last 5 years has really marked this kind of significant movement from trend to mainstay. All that to say, I think this idea is really here to stay. The first piece of information that I think really informs why we're feeling this pressure is really well articulated in a study by 2 researchers published in by the Harvard Business Review, who really pointed to this shift since 2016. They have talked about how companies have long been kind of behind the scenes activists, and we can see that, through lobbying, political contributions, and even funding issues-based work. But in the wake of the 2016 election, there was this very public, very measured shift towards CEO and company level activism. These 2 researchers really attribute that to an increase in political partisanship and this kind of gridlock in DC that wasn't moving things, and companies looking at kind of that matrix of responsibility and trust and saying, this is our job to move something forward. The second piece that I think is really interesting to kind of talk about is in that same time period, we also saw an increase in the number of platforms that were really driven by visual content. So Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, oh my God, the last 2 years, right? TikTok. And it's really kind of brought companies closer to consumers. So a lot of consumers were on those platforms prior to 2016. What happened is companies saw this huge influx in usage and conversation. And so all of a sudden you're closer. And it's very visual, and the way that visual communications works wires our brains differently. It triggers a different emotional center than words or some of these other actions we take. And so all of a sudden we see this pressure coming from this increased use of social. The third thing I think is really important to acknowledge is this increase in Gen Z entering the workforce. They are really these like digital natives, kind of the first generation we're seeing that is super cause and ethical oriented from really birth on. They were kind of taught that social justice, economic justice, environmental justice is part of their responsibility. And they also have this increase in consumer power all of a sudden because they're making salaries, they're making moves. So that wave on top of the millennial generation is really, really starting to cause a lot of pressure on companies to take action. There's this interesting survey from Do Something, and you guys are probably all very familiar with these data points, but 76% of respondents said they have purchased or would consider purchasing from a company to show support for the issues they support. And 67% said they'd stop purchasing or would consider if a company stood for something that didn't align with their values. Interestingly enough, we have a couple of Gen Zers in our office, and our conversations are really, really different. I think they talk a lot about the things that they're boycotting as a result of kind of the way companies are going in a way that is not as common from even us as kind of late or early millennials.
Just a little bit like later.
Trying to think of what we are.
A little bit later.
Again, and then kind of on top of that, we saw this movement towards cancel culture, right? That all of a sudden, there's a study done by Porter Novelli that said that 64% of Americans thought that it has given them a voice to influence companies. And I want to pause on that. All of a sudden, 64% of Americans are saying, I have a say in what you do as a company. That has never happened before. They're saying you have to act based on how I respond to you. And there's kind of this last piece of public pressure. So there's this kind of real and perceived pressure on brands, largely because of this environment that's around them. I think anecdotally, Corey and I, when we talk to companies about this, we're kind of in, often they come to us in crisis mode saying, what do we do? How do we respond? The first reason they do that is because all of a sudden they're saying, we saw so-and-so do it. I feel this pressure to do that. And I want to acknowledge that pressure, because saying that's not important isn't true. It is important. And I think there is this professor, Nusha Warren at ASU, who said it best. If you talk and I stay silent, my silence now seems like I'm on the other side. And that pressure is real and really important for us to acknowledge as a part of this dynamic. So now we insert the past kind of 20 months, and this has really all brought us to a tipping point. And, the public statements and actions are not really fading into the distance. This is part of our reality, and we need to build a plan for it. Our consumers are expecting us to go on record as our employees, and they want our values and stances to be established and really tied to a plan. So that's a little bit of the landscape that's gotten us here. And now we're going to talk about where we go from here. Okay. Take a moment. That was a lot to digest. Again, I said all of those resources are available. Email me. I'm happy to share that research. It's fascinating. If you ever really want to stay up late in bed and, sip some wine, it'll be good reading material.
She can also share Cliff's notes, because that's usually what I ask for. She's very good at that.
Totally happy to do that. So we're kind of getting into the steps. So now we understand the pressure. You have all felt that pressure. Hopefully you have some now reasons to articulate why that pressure is here. And the first step in this process is really pause and assess. So when somebody comes to us in crisis, this is really where we start walking through to say, where are we at? I think that we like to start with the question, why? So when somebody says, we need to respond, I love to go back and say, why? And most often, I think Corey would agree, the first answer we get is because I feel pressure, everyone else is doing it, la da 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 da, it's that sort of thing. And that's where we like to say, I understand that, I acknowledge that. Let's see if we can come up with a better why. And so this is really that moment to pause and really bring that up. Our goal here is to just dig a little deeper before we start putting words down or assigning that to some communicator in-house. We also think it's really, really important as a next question. So we've determined that maybe we don't have our why established. The next piece is to really think about who the issue impacts, and really prioritizing those audiences. I think we saw this happen a lot over last summer as we looked at some of the George Floyd murder and the trial and verdict. We really saw companies digging deep to think about how this was hitting their employees, customers, and communities, and start to really build maps of how that's hitting people. So, I think it affected everyone in some way. There were people more close to the center of the action. So companies based in Minneapolis, St. Paul, companies who had large groups of employees who may have experienced some of that trauma firsthand, who all of a sudden had to say, we actually have to create space for those employees before we start communicating. And so really thinking about that and the impact and creating sort of a matrix of impact. The next piece, kind of closer to home that we saw was the shooting in Boulder. So again, closer to home. And the way we sort of approached that was with companies who had employees, customers based in Boulder who would have felt the impact of that in their everyday lives. I think we talked a little bit that was my, one of our employees said, that's my King Soopers, like I go there. And so really pausing and taking a moment to say, okay, this is a different trauma now. We have to have a plan to deal with that trauma before we start to take a stance. Again, that's another issue where the impact was, the public conversation was much bigger, but the communication around that was a lot more centered around Boulder and where we go there. So from there, the next question we want to talk about is, okay, we've determined those pieces. We really want to have a dialogue about what who does this statement serve? So who are we really serving by saying something about this? And I think that's an important external comms question. Are you sharing a message because you're trying to build your brand? Or are you sharing a message because you want to empower someone, you want to educate someone, you have unique resources that you want to share? I think those are all very important things to kind of identify. And so we would fall in the line of sharing a statement. If you have a model, if you have a program, if you have a resource, or if you know someone and have an expert that you want to elevate, is really important. If it is just indeed to kind of add to the noise, we would say that's probably not a great reason why. I think it's also really important to kind of think about this idea that public statements aren't meant to win over your audience. In fact, I think the best and most engaging public statements often result in some level of backlash. And in some ways, we see that as a positive. It means that you've hit on a nerve, you have made someone uncomfortable, or likely you've made someone very comfortable by saying that you've seen them. And I think this is important as a step to prepare kind of your C-suite or others in kind of your marketing team to say, listen, if we make a statement, we need to expect, and we've done it well, that there will be unsubscribes. And in fact, in some ways, we see unsubscribes as, or kind of that negative feedback as, something that you've been heard. So that means you have delivered a message that you've been heard. Again, you want to kind of consider this into your strategy and really take a moment to think about who's going to respond to that feedback and then create a process for response. We don't want someone who's firing off messages in the moment. And in fact, we want to probably establish kind of some standard responses to messages that say, we have an open forum. We appreciate that feedback and we'll share that, and have a way that you're going to process and share that feedback and compile it. It's also probably really important for whomever is going to be managing that response to have some training and, maybe consider giving them a little personal time, because those can be a lot to take in these moments that are a little bit more provocative. We want to make sure that this is kind of the last step to really think through your audiences. We want to prioritize who we're talking to. I think the immediate response is to be let's jump on social media because it's so fast. We often recommend that the first message is to your employee base and that stays internal. Now that could go external at any moment. You want to be prepared for that, but really prioritizing them and kind of those stakeholders on the inside of the group before we start to tear that out to a more public stance. So really thinking through a process of step one, who we're talking to, step two. And lastly, we just want to make sure that, your house is in order in this process. What we mean by this is just asking some questions and maybe having a matrix based on your priorities that say, do our internal practices match our external message? So, in the case of the racial justice movement and kind of the response to the George Floyd murder, we often sat and asked companies, okay, what is your track record on this? Where have you been public? How have you been building your employee base along this? Where have you invested dollars? And also, what pitfalls have you made along the way? And if you can't have that dialogue, this is probably not the time to go public. You want to get that house in order before you respond. The way we sort of wrap this up is just by saying that, artificial plants will never bear fruit. And if your message is artificial, it's never going to bring your stakeholders closer, which is really what we're trying to do here.
Absolutely. All right, so now that you've taken sort of this moment to pause and assess the situation and essentially establish the why and the how that you're going to move forward, it's really extra important to remember that the words you do craft and put out into the world, they really matter. Words have power, and words can really have a major impact on audiences you may never even anticipate. As Sarah was talking, my really going through this process of every time we've helped a company or a client craft a statement, every time we've crafted our own statements, it's sort of like following the methodology of crisis communications or issues management, which some of you may have had more experience than others, but it's really thinking through how much power those words are going to have and trying to anticipate the blowback or the positive as much as you can, because when you enter into this space of public statements and really either supporting or going against an issue that is really polarized in society, I mean, you are essentially setting yourself up for issues and for challenges to come back to you. And that is not a bad thing, right? There's a good reason that might happen, but you really want to be prepared and really think through those words. So a couple things to think about when you're actually crafting the language to put out there in response to whatever it is that you feel this pressure and desire to respond to. So first, just be direct. You know, we sometimes see statements out there that talk in these sort of grandiose ways, reference an issue super broadly, but don't ever really get to the heart and soul of the actual thing that sparked you, that why, the why that you're there at the table. Also avoid being really vague, you know, like saying we support all of this, right? Like, again, it just feels really inauthentic and goes back to some of those concerns that you guys were mentioning in the chat function. So be as direct as possible. If you are addressing a very specific instance that occurred, mention it. Call it out.
Use the words.
Use the
Don't
words. Exactly. Don't be afraid of the words. Because at the end of the day, like if your legal team is reviewing this and saying, oh, we can't be that direct, then you shouldn't be taking a stance on this issue, right? And that should be one of your filters. Also, have a lot of people read the statement. Create sort of a process for editing and reviewing and thinking it through from different lenses. You know, maybe you have someone come in from legal, you have someone come in from PR, you have someone come in from HR. Bring people in who review language through a different lens and understand the impacts it may have on different audiences.
I also think it's important to bring in people who have different, if you are commenting on a social justice situation, people with different lived experience are going to tell you, they're going to help you find those pitfalls. What is really helpful is to have them in place long before the issue arises. So making sure they're on the response team, they understand the role, and they're being compensated for that role.
Absolutely. You know, and it may also, as you're going through this process, if you realize you don't have somebody in that position for your company, be honest about that. You know, that is an action step that you can take as a result of going through this process for the statement. We, company X, have put together this group of individuals, this committee, to really look at our policies and what we have in place, because we are recognizing we are not considering certain lived experiences and certain individuals that are in our company and recognizing them and appreciating them.
Absolutely.
So really important. So next is to be transparent. You know, Sarah mentioned this earlier. If you have, as a company, if this issue has made you realize that you've messed up or you've fallen short or you don't have certain policies in place to avoid these missteps that someone else has experienced, say that, right? We are big believers in that kind of transparency, but only do it if you're willing to say what's the change you're going to make as a result of recognizing that shortfall. And be really specific. You know, we're really big believers that people will not pick apart a statement if there's honesty and true transparency built into it. And that doesn't mean you need to share everything, but if you can share the details of specific things that will really resonate with those audiences you've really determined you care about, you'll be a lot more successful in the long run. Okay, so next up, focus on substance, right?
These statements are typically not short.
They're
I just
not.
want to prepare you for that.
You know, when you focus on substance over like style or format, you will really ensure that you're heard and you're seen by your stakeholders and you're not just scrolled through with everyone else's black box on Instagram, right? Like focus on what matters to you and what matters to the people that you care about. All right, next up. Know who is drafting the statement. This is kind of like PR 101. And make sure you have buy-in at all levels. There have been a number of times that we've seen, even just in the last couple of years, where very public statements are put out there and it is very clearly crafted by their social media expert or their PR person, right? Not
Who probably did feel that way.
Felt that way, exactly. But we can see that it isn't representative of a company's values, of a company's stance. It is representative of that individual. And the same goes for, sometimes we see comments or statements made from just the CEO, and the CEO is saying, this is how I feel today on this Tuesday, instead of this is how I think my company and representing this brand as a whole should be responding in this moment. You know, and that said, like, having the message come from the top is important because it shows leadership buy-in. But in actually crafting the statement, you need to make sure you're looking at it through a bunch of different filters, all the ones that we've just mentioned. You know, we also kind of, again, I want to hark back to what Sarah was saying. We caution you from just sort of taking advantage of employees who have lived experience, asking them to make statements with using the word we when it is a very personal experience to them. Be really thoughtful about how you're engaging them in that process. It's one thing to ask them to be a filter to help you craft the language, and also a filter to help determine how to change policies internally. It's another thing to ask them to make the statement on your behalf.
Yeah, totally.
All right, so next up, do your research. Just as media outlets do their own fact checking, as a communicator, you should always be validating your sources before you post information, and really ensure that when you're asking someone to take an action, that action is something that can really have impact and is kind of leading them to an actual truthful, real place, whether it's online or at your company. Excuse me, if you are asking for donations to something, which sometimes is a part of making a public statement, make sure you're doing it authentically. Don't just include a link on there that you saw on Facebook. You know, make sure that you're really doing your due diligence. If you are going to support an organization, make sure that organization knows you're doing this, and that if those dollars come, while they, yes, have to be able to be good stewards of those funds, you as an essential ambassador for them also need to be a good steward. So make sure that you have that information. Let's see, I just lost my place, sorry.
You know, one other thing I will say about kind of the sharing of content, because I think we see this universally, is just making sure that you're crediting those who have created really interesting artwork or quoting. If you're quoting something, I think there's a lot of that happens either on social or embedded in post, and you just want to make sure you're giving credit to the person with who is the creator of that.
Yeah, and that would be the same if you're asking your employees to contribute their thoughts too. Credit them, make them a part of this process. If you're a company that kind of has put a stake in the ground that you care about your employees, really show that you care about them. It's more than just giving them a party on Fridays, right? Like, bring them up to the level of conversation, allow them to contribute, and really have a stake in the future of what your company does. All right, next up, connect issues to systems, not individuals. You know, this is probably one of the most important principles of ethical communications. It really is, how are you as a company standing up for something that is systemic and not just this one thing that happened? You know, I think the George Floyd, what happened there is a great example of that. Like, yes, what happened to this one individual was tragic and horrible, but really it was representative of something that was truly systemic. And the most powerful public statements that came out around that are from the companies that took a stance, not just against the instance, but against the systemic challenges that kind of led to it and continue to lead to situations that are similar, and those companies that actually took action. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. So next up is the plan for delivery. So really think through, you've got the words maybe down on paper, it's been reviewed by all the filters, legal's approved it, you know, how do you actually get it out into the world, and what will you be using to deliver the message and make the right impact? So really take a step back and think about, what are all the mediums you have access to, and who are the audiences that are tied to it? Again, classic PR strategy here, right? Really thinking like, is this message, these are the people I care about, is Instagram the right place to put this message? Just because everyone else put it on Instagram, is that the right medium for us as a company? Because you can still be a part of the public statement trend.
In fact, we have a really ugly example of how
we do.
That has gone wrong.
We will share the ugly thing, the bad.
Yes.
All right. So then also think about the visuals that you're going to use. Is it just words that you want to share, or are there visuals associated? And are those visuals representative of all the things they should be representative of, right? Really thinking through the impact that those images might have on the audiences that you're targeting. So again, it's just really thinking through those filters as much as you can. And, you know, are they really in alignment with the statement you're making, but also with your brand as a company. Are you trying to just use the trends that are happening out there in the world, or is it really truly representative of what you stand for?
You know, one other little tip on the visual side is that often I think we see companies use stock, like not images from their own community action or of employees, or even video to kind of back these statements up. And I really want to encourage you to think about the impact of tagging a really public statement like this with some employees and making sure that those employees will not be personally negatively impacted by having those two things tied together. It's something that gets overlooked, I think, quite often. And unfortunately, there are stories of employees who have been put at risk, who have kind of weren't ready to have that dialogue and don't feel they represent the company. And so really making sure you're auditing that for that pitfall.
Absolutely. And so last and definitely not least, there's been a lot of discussion out in the world about this call-in culture versus call-out culture. Call-out culture is what we really have seen in this sort of cancel culture world, pointing fingers, making a statement, and really making people take a step back to think about their actions. Call-in culture is something that we try to utilize as often as possible in communications, especially with public statements. It's this idea of, rather than just sharing your concern, pointing a finger, and sometimes re-traumatizing as a result, we are asking you to take a step back and consider how you can invite others in to join you in this process of thinking, how has this impacted me? How has this impacted my employees? How has this impacted the world? And what can we collectively do? And call-in culture also allows for differing opinions, right? And you're saying it's okay if we don't see eye to eye. It's okay if we don't agree on a lot of things, but these are the reasons we think we should agree on this path. And how can we kind of come together to have that conversation? So big believers in the call-in culture versus the call-out culture in public statements.
So we have gone through two really meaty sessions.
It's here, a lot.
And we understand it's a lot. I do want to just acknowledge that for those of you who may find yourself in this situation in the future, this is not fast. It does not go quickly, especially if you're trying to pull all of this together without a foundation. And that is intentional. I think we give permission sometimes for statements to come later, a week, 2 weeks out, because then they are more meaningful. What does help is the preparation. So taking all of the things that we talked about and really laying a foundation to get ahead. And we'll talk about that a little. We wanted to share one example of a statement we actually found really powerful. So last year, GAP shared a statement on justice and equality for all. And they talked a lot about kind of the history that they had related to standing up for racial justice, for LGBTQ and other differences, and talked a little bit about kind of what they've learned along the way and where they went. And I thought it was a really well-crafted statement that kind of showed you the depth, and they really audited all of what they've done. They also had a CEO, I believe it was a video that went live too, that was really from the heart and talked about more personally what it meant for their CEO to kind of make this commitment and to do this. And they talked a little bit about how they hold space for employees. Again, I thought that was a tremendous example.
All right, so you've made your statement. Now, what are the things that you should be doing to sort of get ahead? And we certainly actually had a lot of conversation about how much time we wanted to spend on this, because it does kind of go a little bit beyond just the statement. But we're big believers that if you're going to make the statement, you also need to think through what you're doing internally, and that could be a whole other webinar. However, some things that we wanted to bring up just to give you some sort of tips on how you can build communications planning into your thinking about sort of policy and program.
Knowing it's here to stay.
It's here to stay, yeah. Exactly. So this era of public statements or of brands taking a stand, it's not going anywhere. And we're probably going to have another one any moment now. Something else is going to go viral, something else is going to happen in our world, because it's the world we live in. So we are believers, again, that it's best to get ahead by kind of creating the how you want to engage, even if it's it needs to be really like applied, I'm trying to think of the right word. Like it may not be like applicable in every instance, but you're kind of creating the skeleton approach. Okay, so the first thing to think about is committing to issue fluency. So issue fluency is really tied to how we communicate about issues consistently and in ways that sort of demonstrate how you as a company or a brand understand a topic more broadly. And this isn't, we're not talking about like a one-time campaign or a single message. This is truly sort of committing to issues broadly and then being able to be responsive and reactively put a statement out there, but kind of like falling back on these values that you already have in place. So for example, and this is probably a very detailed example, but for those of you who know Ben and Jerry's, the ice cream company, if you follow them on social media, they don't do a whole lot of talking about ice cream. They do a lot of talking about these issues that they care about. You know, they have had a long track record of speaking out on social and racial injustice, climate change, and refugee rights, and they are frequently putting messages out there. Again, does that mean that you need to do that same approach? But when something happens that impacts one of those issue areas, they can very authentically put a statement out there. So for those of you who aren't comfortable living in the Ben and Jerry world of communications, a good place to start is taking a step back and looking at your CSR commitments. I bet many of you have pillars or focus areas. And instead of just thinking about, okay, these are the programs that we're going to implement or the nonprofit partnerships or the donations we're going to make, craft a public statement that could be tweaked to be relatable to a certain instance and kind of have it at the ready, right? Like,
or
this is what
share
we see.
some of your knowledge.
Exactly. Yeah. So you've got that information there and it feels authentic, but you also know this is our stance on this issue. This is why we care about this particular issue, so that it already exists in the world. So when something happens that really impacts that issue area, you can more authentically stand up for it. Okay. So next up, create a filter. So most companies have crisis comms plans or issues management plans already in place. These kind of plans really help companies determine the who, when, how, why you communicate when an issue arises. And essentially, we want you to create a similar plan for public statements, right? And how you want to respond to those issues. So create sort of a filter for how you look through the world when something like this arises. And what's your call tree? Who are the people you want to bring to the table? You know, I just did a training yesterday on crisis communications for a large nonprofit. And the first step is always pull your crisis team together. So have a public statement team in place and
have everybody
everyone pre-identified, so you know who needs to be at the table to provide their input and give you kind of their perspective. You know, going back to what I said earlier of maybe it's someone from legal, definitely someone from the leadership team, probably someone from HR, definitely someone from PR, you know, like bring those people in so you already know who you're going to call in from a filter standpoint.
I would just like to add, there is a really great resource out there by, it's Rally Brands.
Mm-hmm.
They have a brand advocacy map that's a fairly simple in concept idea of kind of an axis and where you can rate yourself on certain criteria.
Yep.
Again, happy to share that link or that resource, but I think it is just a really relatable and practical tool for people to use.
Awesome. I'm going to keep going quickly because I just checked the time and I know we're running short. So the next piece here, consistency is key. Just remember to engage early, often, and in meaningful ways. And so don't just sit back and wait and see how many of your competitors are going to make a stance. Be willing to be the first. Invest internally. And this one is probably like the broadest because there's the most opportunity here, but really think about how you can create space for employees to process what they've just seen come out from their employer. And then what can you do or how can you help them act? Because a lot of times when people see a statement like this, just for the same reason that your company chose to make a statement, when an employee sees that their employer made a statement, their next thing is going to be, I want to do something. I want to act. So help create that space for them to determine how they can move forward. And also think about your own internal policies. And that is, again, a whole other conversation. And then lastly, you know, think about donating to those doing the good work. You know, think about organizations who are truly moving the needle on these issues that you've taken a stance on, and then ask them to help educate you. Ask them to help you craft the message. Think through the action steps that others can make. If you feel the need to sort of challenge your peers to take an action, make sure you're asking them to do something authentic and bring the right people to the table to figure out what those action steps are.
You know, I think I would make a case that as a part of your CSR strategy, building in, you know, really having identified those areas and then making sure that you do have people in your mix of giving or volunteerism who who are doing the work on some of these issues you know may sort of be triggering for your company. My bet is many of you already have them built in. You may not be thinking of them through this filter, but I think it's a really good idea.
Absolutely. All right, so now we're going to share some examples.
For sure. We're going to run through this pretty quickly because I think that there are many out there. I'm sure many of you have sat back and critiqued and enjoyed some of what's come out. I do want to just kind of acknowledge first that Netflix is kind of a more recent in terms of making commitments on kind of social issues. You know, I think for a long time they were really focused on entertainment and really started to look at their policies. They made a commitment in 2018 to diversity and inclusion. They started launching programs which really were in line with that, which I think shows that. And then they also have made great strides on increasing the number of Black and brown employees on their roster and really have been tracking and sharing that data. So I think that's really helpful. Then all of a sudden they announced that they were going to donate $100 million to Black owned banks as kind of their investment strategy. So again, a layer and layer and layer. And I think what I like here is that, you know, there certainly was they did a report on inclusion, very public. And then all of a sudden it became so natural when they wanted to start responding to about racial justice. They had this great track record available to them. So there's lots of publicly available information on this. I would encourage you to go look. Locally, I had a feeling that someone would ask that question, who's a local example. I actually would love to point to Delta Dental, Colorado. I think we may have someone on the call from there, but I really did appreciate their statement last June, I think it was, on equity. And it did sort of acknowledge that they started this journey more recently in terms of, you know, where they're at and looking at data to help them really move the issues. And then talked, you know, a lot in this letter about how they're moving investments and taking action as a result. So again, I think that's a really great Colorado-based example that may be a little more relatable for some of us. So going to the bad, I think a lot of you may have seen this or are aware, but, you know, one thing that I think makes a statement bad is, again, not that track record, but also the fact that a statement all of a sudden detracts from the issue. And we saw this with a bunch of the music streaming services who actually were credited with kind of the black box last year, saying, you know, stop the streaming or whatever it was to give space. And unfortunately, it was a little hollow. There wasn't a lot of action to back it up. And in addition, they didn't think through the fact that all of a sudden it was taking away space from actual Black voices who we were trying to elevate on that day. And it really cascaded out of sight and out of control. And I think they suffered quite a bit of backlash as a result, as it being just kind of this, you know, shallow, not great kind of approach to that. So good sentiment, but not great. Again, we don't want to call out any names, but we thought it'd just be good to give a few criteria for the ugly.
Yeah. I would say that these things are the, you know, before you do anything, ask if you say yes, like if what you're going to do is falls in the yes for any of these, don't. Easiest way to look at it. So again, the ugly filter, maybe that's what we call it. I don't know if that's PC. I don't know. The ugly filter. Don't be the one to engage once and walk away, because it's going to be really obvious to those you're trying to impact. Focus on words rather than actions. So like really think through the statement that I'm taking and not just a black box on a screen. Those who take credit for the experience or the thoughts and actions of those with lived experience, you know, it's not to point too many fingers, but it makes me think of like certain social influencers who are like, oh, I experienced this, but they didn't, right? Like be really thoughtful, because putting yourself in the shoes of those with lived experience, it's a really negative impact on them. I would hope this is obvious, but don't be hypocritical or willfully ignorant.
I don't want to, you know, again, I said we weren't going to do this, but it's very public right now. You know, I think ExxonMobil, unfortunately, is going through a time period where they have been a little tone deaf to their past and more recent history on climate change. And unfortunately, even though they have sort of publicly made some statements around that, they have not also acknowledged some of the faults they've made in the past. And that's really causing a lot of public outrage currently. Don't do that. Don't be in that situation.
Don't.
You can make a mistake. You just have to acknowledge you made one.
Exactly. Also be really cautious that the words you use don't lack cultural competency or issue competency. And this is where we really encourage you to invite people in to educate you before you craft a message. Don't say something, you know, going back to that very first thing we told you, be direct. Don't lack transparency. You know, if it feels like it's gathered through 5 legal filters, it's probably not the public statement you want to make.
Yeah.
And lastly, don't fail to acknowledge the role that you play in this larger issue.
Totally.
So, yeah.
Again, the ugly filter. I think
The ugly filter.
Trademark.
All right,
we have
guys.
gone through so much.
Yeah, and we've left just a couple minutes for questions. I am looking to see if
Feel free to pop them in the chat
Yeah.
if there's something specific. Again, happy to share any of the links or resources that we mentioned throughout this presentation.
But we clearly could talk about this all day. We are super passionate. We are words people. We want people to be authentic as authentic as possible. So any questions? Not seeing any come in. We're happy to stick on though for a few minutes, but thank you all again for allowing us to come on and talk about one of our favorite topics. And I think I will hand it. Oh, I don't want to forget to mention, if you are in a place where you are curious about a statement or wanting to get there, we are
getting your ducks in a row.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We love talking and we love talking to all of you. So we are always happy to schedule free 30-minute consults. You can go to our website. It goes right to a calendar scheduler, and we'd be more than happy to
Honestly,
just brainstorm.
The more of us that do this better, the better it looks for all of us. And so this is just kind of our give back in a way to kind of support with our knowledge and experience you as you go through this.
Let's see. Looks like Jen had a question. Okay, so there were times during racial unrest that everyone had a statement and they started to seem hollow. How do you know the when, kind of when should you weigh in?
Yeah.
Great question.
I think that's a great question, and unfortunately not a super simple answer. I think for us, going back to that filter of, do we have prior action? Do we have a commitment in mind? Do we have a way to sort of back up what we're doing or to lead forward? Are we willing to admit some of our mistakes? I think those things really help guide that. And I think you can also, for example, we similarly, as a very small company, felt some of that pressure too. As our team kind of ran it through our own filters, what we realized is that as communicators, our role in talking about this was about the idea of listening and learning and how we can all use that as a skill in this moment. And so, I think for us, the way that we approached sharing a message was more about giving people a way to take action that is easy, but maybe uncomfortable. And so walking through some criteria that we use to allow you to learn in this moment that we use to inform our team. So
yeah, one other thing I'll add too, and I've been down this road a few times with some of our clients. We work with organizations that have really passionate leaders, and there have been a number of times, especially in the last year, where those leaders will call and say, we have to make this statement. And so sometimes I find myself, I ask a lot of questions and I'll say, okay, tell me why, kind of going back to that filter we gave you earlier. And we get to this place often where they're like, okay, I've actually just said my piece. I feel better.
They just needed to air it.
Yeah. And so sometimes as communicators, it's our job to be that sounding board. And there are times absolutely where we get to the end of the conversation. It's like, okay, yeah, we should make a statement because it's in alignment with your organization's values. It's in alignment with your values as the leader. And you can back it up with an action that you're going to take as a result.
Maybe a helpful tip too, if you really get to the point where you're like, I don't think we should be taking an action, is the idea of leaving space for others. So, I understand person who's giving me pressure that you're really passionate about this. I don't know that as a company we have issue fluency on this, but what we do have are great partners or resources that we can sort of elevate as a result. And so using your platforms to elevate can sometimes be a nice way to scratch that itch. And then I would encourage you to follow up with like, why don't we have fluency on this? How might we remedy that for the next time, and kind of move towards that internal systems change?
Yep, and it looks like we got one more question. I know we're super tight on time. So the question was, do you have thoughts on taking a stance on Instagram without a social prompt, like the murder of George Floyd? So basically just being the one to instigate this public stance.
I think I'm pretty anti leading with social in general. I think the best stances or statements are linked back to something much longer. And I think that is part of authenticity, is that if the only thing you have to say can be summarized in an image and a paragraph on Instagram, I pretty well question if that is right. Like, I don't think that should be enough. So that's how I feel.
I feel the same way. I think social media is a really great medium and has really great purposes. I think it shouldn't, for me, be the only thing when you're making a statement or taking a stance, but yeah, hopefully that answered the question. All right, I think those are all of our questions. Thank you all again. We'll hand it back over. I forget who was doing it. I think it was Angie was doing the closing.
Yeah. Thank you both so much. That was incredibly helpful. And I think you, as someone who's in communications and certainly involved in corporate social responsibility, there's so many things we want to say. And I really liked when you were talking about not calling out, but calling in. That seems like, once you said it, a simple concept, but not something I'd really thought about before. So super, super thankful for you both. And to everyone who joined us today, I hope that you had some great takeaways, and we'll take advantage of Sarah and Corey's offer to do some consultation. So as a reminder, you will receive an email after this event. We'll send resources as well as the recording. We will also be sending out a brief survey, because we really want to know what kind of programs we can put on that are going to be attractive to you, that are going to answer your questions. So please do fill that out. And we do have 3 events we want to highlight: a CSR peer roundtable with Twilio on November 18th. We will have another roundtable happening on December 9th. And then finally, a leadership and action event, which will be a panel and networking session on December 16th. So thank you all once again, Sarah and Corey. Big round of applause. Thank you. And I hope everyone has a great day.